So then, we are back with more understanding from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This word is then the scripture, the original manuscripts, from the Israelites, so then we can understand the time of the end. And then so many of the projects going on, where our country has then financed. Let's evaluate then what the Messiah has said regarding the time of the end. We understand it from the manuscripts, where then you find Gelah, or Revelation 1:8, where then you read the Messiah speaking of then the freighters. But then let's evaluate precisely why the Messiah said freighters rather than nations. There is a reason for it, and then we have to find out why the Messiah then decided to change the authority from countries and nations, and then he mentioned freighters. So let's evaluate why then is freighter rather than country or nation or kingdom. The Messiah then has stated during a period of time where then the name is time of restoration. Restoration of what? The holy cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. We find these in Yeshayahu, then the 61st chapter, and then you understand what those cities are. As the cities then are returning, then there is a layer of understanding of it related with the Gentiles. And the Gentiles, obviously, they are going to be related with the Ishmaelites, or the first son of Ibrahim. The second son of Ibrahim is related solely with tabernacling. So let's try to understand what goes on, for instance, in Antarctica. Some years back it was built a huge scientific experimental station in the South Pole. Was it a decent project? Quite honestly, it was a waste of money. It won't be used. There is no relevancy. Let's evaluate why the Messiah then said the freighters of the earth. There is a reason for it. Some people tend to believe, for instance, in terms of religion. Natural understanding of it would the Messiah then point to the religious establishment related with Babylon. So then when we read the scripture related with the spirit of Babylon, you can understand sin. Because that's what the idea comes from. Tower of Babel, they're trying to make themselves as God, build the tower into heaven and such. And then the Creator confused the language amongst the 70 languages known. So then, the Messiah, obviously, when he was expounding the understanding related with Babylon, why did he not use the nations? We have to have a step of formation. First we find Daniel explaining then the base of the statue. Iron does not mix with the clay. So some kingdoms would be strong, some kingdoms would be weak. So the natural fact would have then the nations that are strong as iron being mentioned during the time of the restoration by the Messiah himself. Would be the most evident, most obvious. But the Messiah didn't. But let's evaluate the statue of Daniel. Head of gold was Babylon, Middle Persians then silver, and then bronze, Alexander the Great. and then legs of iron, Rome, and then the base, iron and clay. So each of those are then represented, except the base of the statue, a kingdom. But then we understand those nations that are strong. Then we find a section, for instance, in Daniel. We find sections of it in Ezekiel. And Daniel 11 shows then the strong nations or strong kingdoms of the time of restoration, where you understand then iron. Why did not the Messiah then had taken this relevancy of the 11th chapter, explaining the area of restoration amongst many other verses? But particularly, we have to layer the 61st chapter of Yeshayahu with the 2nd chapter of Daniel, then with the 11th chapter of Daniel. Why did he not mention then kingdoms, or those kingdoms known as iron, such as the kingdom of the north, east, and then south? Those are considered iron. So why the Messiah then mentioned freighters? Let's evaluate. There are logical steps of formation when the Messiah then is teaching. However, when he does, we must understand what governments are doing and what they've learned during the time of 1,000 years of deceit. Then obviously the Messiah explains these areas related with the time of restoration, because Gelah 1:8 is for the time of restoration, prior of the starting of Autumn Feast. When the translators began to translate Gelah, they did not understand that chapter 1:8 does not belong with Gelah, as we know as Revelation. It's for the time of restoration. But they did not know how to layer it. Then they layered wrong. As we understand, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd chapters of Revelation don't belong with the Autumn Feast. Quite honestly, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd chapters, they belong with Spring Feast. And after the Spring Feast came the time of transition, and the objective of the tabernacling was showing them that the Spring Feast was then completed. What was then lacking as far as when the Messiah came down from Mount Gerizim after opening of the seals was then Autumn Feast. So besides the sound of the shofar, whatsoever is left is either time of Spring Feast or restoration. So then why has the Messiah then said freighters? Because the Messiah knew the freighters would be in charge. But then when the freighters are in charge, must have a system. What do we understand of a system? When you're speaking of a freighter, you have to understand a system. You have to understand labeling. You have to understand how to scan a package and what is related with it. We are no longer speaking of governments. The governments of this world, they are no longer in charge. The freighters are in charge. So then, evaluating from the time of the 1,000 years of deceit, we find, for instance, this huge construction over there in the South Pole. The main question is, besides the funding from the government, can the place sustain itself? Because there is oil over there. That's the whole purpose of this station. Is it feasible for a company to get oil from there? So far away? It's not. It's cheaper to have either from South America or from someplace else. Because the understanding is there is a relationship with the first son, the Ishmaelites, and the second son, where then the world then is served with crude. And the freighters are in charge. So let's ask this question. Since the Messiah knows best, would it be feasible for freighters of having this station in the south where they can get crude from? No way. It's expensive. And since our country then was given 5 years of monetary active system 2 years ago, we have 36 months to get our government in line with the freighters. And the freighters of the earth. We have to shift then from what we've learned government-wise during the time of the seat and understand what the Messiah is explaining as far as freighting is concerned. So governments must start lining up themselves with freighters. And the only way it can be lined up is when government starts charging tax for every package. Then what the Messiah said is true. When a label is printed, then the government deducts tax. Then the governments are in line with freighters, because freighters are in charge. We've got 36 months to get our lining of our system with the freighters. When the new system of the East comes, and if we do not have our system lined up with it, it's going to be chaos everywhere. Because the Messiah has said the freighters are in charge. So then we can understand the other layers working in line with the Scripture and the freighters of the earth. Then what can we expect if our government does not do their job as far as taxation is concerned? The fact is, federal people won't get paid, states people won't get paid. Because when the new system comes, there is no way of tracking. The only way of tracking is when the label is generated. This new system incorporates purchasing and investments at the same time. That's why the Messiah then said later, and the freighters of the earth. You have to understand the earnings of investments. This is what the governments should be doing. But some countries, they use the middleman to do it, and they get taxed in turn. Other countries, they do it themselves, such as socialist societies. We in our country have decided to use the middleman, always a scoundrel every time. That's why our country is bankrupt. But we are trying to do the same thing and expect another result. Even though the Messiah is explaining, the freighters are in charge. Because it's no longer what we learned during the time of the 1,000 years of deceit. Is what the Messiah has on his agenda as far as the layer of Gentiles must be lined up when the system comes. Then packages. When the people download the Chinese system in their computers, they want to have packages. And the government can't read it. It's confidential. You transfer your funding into the system, and it's guarded. Then you can invest, you can purchase, and you want your package. But then when the number of packages they quadruple or more, how the government is going to handle so many packages? And those are untracked. And the system is coming. There are lots of updates, for instance, in the Pacific or the Asian market. Must never be disturbed. As it comes from the Pacific, then comes through obviously New Zealand, Australia. Very wisely, they are already updating their backlogs. So when the system comes, then they can always be on a positive, because they understand if it goes to the negative and they can't cover it, then it seizes up. We were always indoctrinated of the mid-man. You know, you give your money to the mid-person, in turn they invest in companies. But when you give your funding to the company, you don't know where it's going. And obviously a lot of it going to the pocket of those people. So eliminating the mid-man, then we directly line up ourselves with a system of a country, where rather than having the mid-man, you get then the benefits of not having a mid-man, but then you have to do the investment yourself. And as the products are purchased, then you get a tiny portion of the earnings. But if you multiply by 900,000 items, then it's a nice paycheck at the end of the month. So the Asian market is already lining up itself. The Pacific is lining up itself. And then the people of Europe and in America, we are going wallowing around, going in circles, trying to find a salvation from an area where there is non-existent. The Messiah said there is a system coming. That's why he mentioned freighters. You have to understand freighters in charge, because then governments are no longer in charge. Why do you think then crude is going to be extremely important? It is so important where you find in a third part of the oceans were contaminated by petroleum. So you find freighters, the Messiah explained, and then you find later petroleum, because chapter 1:8 is before the starting of Revelation. So the Messiah is preparing the understanding of the people prior to the starting of the autumn feast. But when you receive the discounteralized scripture, then the translator made a mistake. Chapter 1:8 is not amongst the 1:9 and 1:7. So this huge project over there in the Antarctica is going to be abandoned. There won't have freighters interested in that spit of ice over there in the midst of the South Pole. These people are insane. Why did they start out this project for? There's no reason. But then they found oil over there, but it's not feasible having oil extracted from that place because it's so cold. That's why freighters, they don't go over there. No investor goes over there because there is no reason. Knowing that the planet has yet 20 years roughly of time, but then people were born during the time of deceit. It's not easy changing the understanding from scoundrelized teachings versus then the real truth. So it was a wasted project. At some point, the station is going to be abandoned. The government is not charging taxes per box or per parcel or per labor. Every label that is printed, the government should be receiving taxes. And they are not doing it. Why do we have to have this understanding? Because chapter 1:8 of Gelah or Revelation does not belong with the autumn feast. This particular chapter belongs from our time until prior of the starting of the autumn feast. Did not Shaul the Shaliach said, and when the sound of the shofar? The focus was what the Messiah had then objectived himself in the future. What was coming next? The autumn feast. The completion of the second section of Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. Thus the shadow prophetic events of the autumn feast. You have then the feasts themselves related with the autumn feast, and then the shadow prophetic events. Then what's coming next? The sound of the shofar. Chapter 1:8 relates with the time of restoration. And the Messiah is already explaining the freighters are going to be in charge. So these, in quote, white elephants projects, they're going to be abandoned. The government won't have any more funding to sustain those places. After 36 months, those people over there should start thinking of, get out of there. The government is not going to pay for it anymore. We thought we were making the proper move because of the oil over there, but it's expensive extracting the oil from the region. It's extremely costly. How are you going to get crude from down there with temperatures so low? Comes out as a tar. You have to have a specialized piping, making sure it's warm enough to get the pump crude pumped out of there. It's not feasible. So let's make sure we understand what the Messiah explains in Gelah 1:8, because it is a restoration writing, and we are during the time of restoration. The rest of it is mostly related then with the autumn feast, when you hear the sounding of the shofar. The rest of it is related with the spring feast or then time of restoration. Thus you understand the layer of Yirmiyahu the prophet, and the cities laid waste for many centuries they would return. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.